Welcome back. This is Lecture 7, the final lecture in our unit on the elements of music. Today I'm going to talk about form, style, and a little bit about the historical periods, which are listed at the very end of the unit, and also a very little bit about some ancient Greek ideas about music and discoveries, I guess, relating to music theory, intervals, etc. But let's start with form. I am not going to talk too much about form as an element of music because we're going to get into form quite a bit, especially when we get into the Baroque era and the Classical era. All I really want for you to understand is the principle behind musical form, the main principle behind, let's say, larger scale, sort of macro scale musical form, the way that a piece is put together. Now, let's look at the book's definition, first of all. It says, form in music is the organization of musical elements in time. Well, that means that pretty much everything that goes into a piece of music has to do with its form, because remember that music is the art of organizing or ordering or forming sounds in time. So every decision that a composer makes about what note to have, or what rhythm to have, what texture to have, what instrument to have, or whether to have singers or instruments, all of that has to do with form. But usually when a music professor or a musician talks about the form of a piece, they are talking about the arrangement of sections within a given piece of music. They usually mean something more along like the macro level, the structure of the thing. And this is where music kind of has a unique challenge, which is that it is an art form which exists in time rather than in space. We might be sort of used to the forms of the visual arts. They're immediately apparent to us because they exist in space, not in time, and we can take them in at once. So, for example, the arch is a very common form used in architecture, right? You can see, triumphal arches in ancient Rome, well, modern day Rome, if they've survived, which some of them have. If you go there, you can see the Arch of Constantine and the Arch of Titus and whatever. But you see that same form in buildings, in bridges, right? You see it actually in dams. A dam is very often in an arch shape because the arch is so strong it can hold back the pressure of the water. So the arch is an example of a type of form. That's a little bit different, though, from a genre, which is another musical phenomenon that you've probably heard that word before, genre. We might say that the arch is a form, but the genre of a bridge, which might use an arch shape, is different from the genre of a dam, which has a different function, which is different from the genre of a building, which might have an arch, right? So we have a form which has to do with how the thing is built, and then we have genre, which is more related to the kind of structure it is, or the kind of building it is. We have the same thing in music. We have different genres of music that may have the same form or may not have the same form as each other. And then we have pieces that might be in the same genre but have a different form. And again, I don't want to get into this too much because we will see plenty of examples of this in the future. But for now, I just wanted to plant that idea in your head that we have such a thing as form and then genre. Genre isn't a textbook term that you have to worry about defining. I don't think they even have the term anywhere in the book defined. But just be aware of that distinction between form and genre. Anyway, my point, part of the point in laying that out was that in the visual arts, very often we can kind of see the form if we know something about forms. So again, going back to the forms of bridges, there are many different types of bridge. There's the arch bridge, there's a suspension bridge, cantilever bridge, truss bridge, whatever. And if you know your bridges, you can look at a bridge and take in the form all at once. With music, you have to listen to it all the way through, and the form is not necessarily going to be obvious. It might not even be obvious if you're not used to listening for form until you get to the very end. The thing that determines form in a piece of music, and this is now in the section where it says techniques that create musical form, there's really one basic principle at work, and it has to do, again, with the fact that we are experiencing something in time when we listen to music. The composer has to strike a balance between two goods, right? Two virtues, we might say. On the one hand, we need to have some variety. If we're experiencing something in time, we need to have some change. Otherwise, we get bored. We lose interest. We stop paying attention, right? However, we can't have constant variety. We can't have things changing all the time. It becomes chaotic, right? It becomes essentially formless. It becomes random. We become confused, right? So we have to have some repetition. We have to have some familiarity. We have to hear things that we heard before come back again. So we say, oh yeah, that makes sense. That ties the form together somehow, right? So there are lots of ways we could describe this phenomenon. The book uses the term repetition and contrast, right? Or you might say familiarity, which is associated with repetition. We repeat something, we become familiar with it. And variety, which we associate with contrast. Both of these are good things, but it's possible to have too much of a good thing, right? They have to be balanced somehow in order for the structure to seem convincing. And it's kind of what it comes down to. It's a piece of music has to be convincing somehow. And it might be convincing for one person and not for another person. It's a subjective thing. But it's kind of similar to the way that the structure of a bridge has to work. If it doesn't have integrity, now of course the consequences are much more dire if the structure of a bridge doesn't have intensity. You drive across the thing and it collapses. And that's an objective fact, whether it collapses or not. In music, it's not. It's more subjective. One person might find a particular structure convincing, like it works, and another person might not. But the same principle is at work. The book, in addition to talking about repetition, talking about contrast, it talks about variation. Variation is sort of like having some repetition and some contrast at the same time. So, for example, there is a very, very popular type of form in music called theme and variation, where the composer presents a theme and then has a different version of that theme, a variation, and then a different yet again, and different yet again. And the composer can decide to have as many variations as he or she chooses to have. Theme and variations, right? And in those variations, some elements are changed, but some are left intact so that the listener can perceive the continuity and say, oh yeah, that's the same theme, but he's changed maybe the texture or the key, or maybe the melody has been embellished, or or the orchestration has changed, or the register, the range has changed. Now we're playing up high instead of down low, whatever it is. And sometimes a composer over a long set of theme and variations will take the variations so far out that gradually, if you were to play maybe one of the later variations and then compare it to the theme, it's hard to tell the relation between the two. But there is a relation. It might be sort of like buried deep within the music, and it might have happened so gradually over the course of the variations that it's been taken out into a place that's unrecognizable, right? Or almost unrecognizable. It can't become completely unrecognizable, or that the structure of theme and variation doesn't work. The composer wants you to recognize the theme in each of the variations, but also wants to show you what he can do with them. Anyway, Theme and variation is just one type of musical form. There are many, many others. I'll talk about one in particular that you might be familiar with, and that is popular song form. Before I do, I should point out that when we analyze the form of a piece of music, we label these different sections with letters. Right? The first section that we come across, we usually call the A section. And then if we come to a contrasting section, we call it B, etc. Right? We also sometimes use lowercase letters for smaller subsections of a piece, right? So it's possible to have, just sort of like in an outline form. You've got large sections and then smaller sections. Large sections get capital letters, small sections get lowercase letters. I'm not going to need for you to analyze any music, so it's not like we're going to be sitting down doing this with A's and B's, but you should just be aware that that's how it's done, because I'm going to use those letters as we talk about one form in particular. Now, there are certain types of musical form that have other terms for their sections. So, for example, when we get to the classical era and we talk about sonata form, the A section of a piece in sonata form is always called the exposition. And then there's a big contrasting B section, we might say, but it's usually called the development section. And then there's sort of a return of the A section at the end, which we call, or a modified return, let's say, which we might call, which we do call the recapitulation. So sometimes we have specific technical terms for the sections within a given form. But broadly speaking, for most types of pieces, we can use A's and B's to analyze. And the book gives an example of one particular type of form called ternary form, which the broad outlines of ternary form are A, an opening A section, a contrasting B section, and then a return of the A section. Very simple. In fact, ternary form is sort of an outgrowth of an even simpler form called binary form, which is simply an A section and a B section. You might look at that and say, well, wait a minute, if we have an A section and then a B section, and that's the entire piece, we've got contrast, but we don't have any repetition, right? Well, what usually happens is, in a binary form, each of those sections repeats. So we have A, B, B. So we do have some contrast. Also, there's such a thing as rounded binary form, where we have an A section which may repeat, and then we have a B section which may repeat, but toward the end of the B section, there's a little bit of A. Some of that A material is brought back to sort of tie the whole thing together, right? So the book talks about ternary form. I just talked about binary form. There are many, many other forms, but I want to talk briefly about one form in particular because it's one that you are familiar with. Whether you realize it or not, you are definitely familiar with it because this form, or something very much like it, is the form that is used for just about every pop song on the radio. And by that I mean, again, rock, country, probably hip-hop, although I don't listen to hip-hop, but pretty sure it would apply there too. And that is a song form, which is sometimes called American popular song form. But it's basically when we have, think of the typical song that you hear on the radio. What do you hear first? There might be sort of an introductory section, right? It may or may not be there, but usually the first thing you hear is the first verse. We could label that first verse A. It's the first section. Now the intro, you could say, well, that's a section too, but it's not really a structural section. It's merely an introduction, right? So it's optional. It could be there, but it's not essential to the structure, right? So let's say we have an intro. We'll put that in parentheses over here, intro. The first important structural section is the first verse, right? And it has a certain melody, it has certain words, right? We hear that first verse, and then what happens? The first chorus, right? It has a different melody, different words. So we have an A section, the first verse, and a B section, the first chorus. What happens after that chorus? We have the second verse. which it might have some slight differences from the first verse. For one thing, the words will be different, but the tune will be basically the same, right? So we're bringing back the A material to help with a sense of familiarity, with repetition, continuity, whatever you want to call it. What happens after that second verse? Second chorus, right? In that second chorus, the words and the melody will be the same as in the first chorus, usually, right? So the choruses differ from the verses in that way. The verses have the same tune but different words. The choruses have the same tune and the same words, 9 times out of 10, right? Okay, notice what's happening though. This pattern is starting to get predictable. Verse, chorus, verse, chorus, A, B, A, B. So this is where we need to change things up so it doesn't become too predictable. And this is where usually we have something called a bridge. We could call it the C section. It is something completely different from what we've heard before. If it's like a rock song, it might be the guitar solo, right? Or some kind of instrumental solo. But in any case, almost always we have something different, some contrasting C section, which musicians usually call the bridge, or sometimes like the breakdown, right? After that contrasting C section, what do we usually have? Usually another verse and another chorus. Sometimes we'll skip over the last verse and go directly to the last chorus. There are some variants of this form, but this form of basically verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus is some version of that is used for almost all popular songs. Right? And next time you listen to one of your favorite songs, listen for the form and figure out how well it conforms to that sort of template that I've just laid out, right? And I think you'll find that most of the time it's pretty close to that. And again, we have an intro at the beginning, maybe. It's optional. We might have sort of an outro at the end. We might have like a fade out or some kind of what we technically would call in the classical music biz a coda. A coda is just a concluding section on the end of a piece of music. It literally comes from the word for a tale. Right? Okay, now, I don't want you to get the idea that form has something to do with verses and choruses. No, just that particular form that I was talking about has verses and choruses, but the principle at work is of repetition, which breeds familiarity, and variety or contrast. These are the two essential elements that composers have to deal with in some way when they are coming up with the form of a piece of music. That's about all I want to say about form because, again, we are going to get into form in detail later on in the semester. Let's talk a little bit about style. You probably have a good intuitive sense of what the term style refers to. It's a very common word. And the book's definition is, in music, style refers to a characteristic way of using melody, rhythm, tone, color, dynamics, harmony, texture, and form. So if form, in a very broad sense, has to do with every decision the composer makes in structuring, in forming sounds to create a piece of music, style refers to the characteristic way in which he or she does this, right? It's kind of inevitable that, of course, there are going to be some composers who have a very unique individual style that is instantly recognizable, and others who are, who are less distinctive within their own time. Not to say that they're any worse, but that perhaps because of the sort of the times that they live in, the artistic style, whatever, the conventions, maybe the demands of the society in terms of what kind of music they want and need, it might dictate that there be some conformity of style, right? That is, that you are conforming to a more or less accepted style, and if you deviate from that too much, it might make it harder for your career, right? And just to give an example, I just talked about this American popular song form, which is so prevalent in all kinds of pop music. You don't see too much deviation from that form. Now you might think that such and such artist is so unique and, oh, this is a completely different sound, but they all use that same form. Why? Because if they didn't, maybe their audience would be confused. Maybe their songs would no longer fit into that 3 or 4 minute slot, which, think about it. Just about all pop songs are about 4 minutes long. Why is that? Because it's a business. Sort of like, why are all Big Macs in this box about this big? Because that's what fits down the little slot that, Big Macs, well, maybe not so much anymore, but in my day there used to be these little chutes that the that the fast food would go down. You put the Big Mac down and it would slide down and the person would take it and hand it to you. Okay? So there's a certain in a business, and music is a business like any other, there are certain constraints, right? Anyway, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but just be aware that certain composers, their style is going to be much more individual and distinctive and instantly recognizable, maybe depending on the times that they are living in. Maybe it's more allowable in a sense. Maybe the market will bear it. And in other times, it might not be the case. There might be kind of like a great deal of conformity, and it's harder to tell, especially for someone who is uninitiated in classical, quote unquote, classical music. It might be hard for you to tell, for example, the difference between a Haydn symphony, a Mozart symphony, and an early Beethoven symphony. It would probably be difficult for you to tell the difference between a Mass by Josquin and a Mass by Palestrina, right? Even though those two composers lived over 100 years apart from each other. Anyway, when we are in this section on musical style, the last page of Unit 1 of the Camion textbook, they have a listing of all these different musical eras and the dates associated with them. We will talk about each of these eras in turn, and when we get to them, you are going to need to know the dates of these eras. I think it's a fundamental thing to know about an era when it happened, right? Dates are important if we're studying any subject kind of like historically. If anyone ever told you, oh, don't worry about the dates, dates aren't important. That's not true. Dates are important, I think, for studying history. They're the first thing to know. It's like, when did this happen? And if you don't know when something happened, how can you know what's a cause and what's an effect? However, we'll talk about these eras as we get to them. And I will point out, of the 7 eras listed there, we're only going to get about halfway through the 5th one, the Romantic era. I also want to point out that the dates they give, and the eras themselves really, are kind of like artificial bins. Like I was talking about the bins that the Big Mac comes down in McDonald's. We have this need somehow to organize things, to categorize things. This is certainly true with genres of music, and you see people having arguments over what was that, hip hop or is it rap, or is this southern rock or is it country? Is this progressive rock or is it, we have this obsession about genres, and I can understand it on one level. It's a means of organizing the world around us and trying to make sense of things, trying to organize things into categories. But very often these categories are artificial, right? And although they are useful, we should recognize that they are artificial, right? So, in regards to these historical eras, the Middle Ages, let's say, the dates they give for the Middle Ages, and I'll talk about this one in our next unit, they're okay, 450 to 1450, but it's not like anything really happened in the year 450 to say, oh, now we're in the Middle Ages, or in the year 1450. Now, there were some important things that happened right around those decades, and particularly 476, which was the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire. Again, it wasn't like it suddenly toppled over. That was when the last Western Roman emperor, who was a 13-year-old boy, was kind of gently nudged off the throne, and the power of Rome for a long time had not really been effectively felt throughout what was once the Western Roman Empire. Likewise, 1450, nothing particularly happened in 1450, but in 1453, a lot of big things happened, including the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, which you might not have been aware there was an Eastern Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was split in two, and when people talk about the fall of Rome, what they're usually talking about is the fall of, or the collapse of the authority of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire continued on with its capital at Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. It was still Constantinople then, when it was taken by the Turks in 1453, that monumentous event, for various reasons, came to symbolize like the end of the Middle Ages, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. The Middle Ages are bracketed by, they've been traditionally defined by historians by the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, there are a lot of other things that were going on at those times, but that's why those dates, those years, if we round them off to 450 and 1450, make it a nice 1,000-year span of history. That's why we have that thing called the Middle Ages. That's what defines it, right? But nobody living during this time said, well, now we're in the Middle Ages, right? That term came to be applied to that period of time later, right? And you might wonder, well, what was it in the middle of anyway? Well, it came to be understood later by people living in the Renaissance, actually, that these Middle Ages were in the middle of the fall of the ancient world at what they saw as the glorious, wonderful ancient world, the time of the Greeks and Romans and all of their accomplishments, and hopefully the revival, the rebirth, one might say, the renaissance of those values, the values of humanism, of striving, of achievement, of the recognition of beauty in the arts and all this stuff, right? And that's, so the period of time in between the end of the ancient world and the revival of, hopefully, the greatness of the ancient world, the Renaissance. So it was people in the Renaissance who looked back on this period in the middle and said, ugh, what a waste, what a terrible time, like middle school, the Middle Ages, right? Now, again, that's a simplified understanding. There was great accomplishment and beauty and scholarship and all of those things in the Middle Ages, but there was also a lot of ignorance and misery and war and disease and all the awful things that we associate with the Middle Ages. Anyway, I'm not going to get too much into all these historical eras like this, but since we're going into the Middle Ages in our next lecture anyway, I thought that might sort of set it up pretty well. The same is true for, to a certain extent, for these other eras. Nobody living in the Baroque era realized they were living in the Baroque era. J.S. Bach didn't say, well, I'm a Baroque composer, so I'm going to write Baroque music. That was a label that was applied to that period later, right? Also, all of these dates, these periods, it seems kind of suspicious that they usually end with a zero, or sometimes two zeros, as if things change just because it's a new century. That's not how it happened. Almost always, there was a very gradual shift from one style to the next, right? It's just that if we're going to make sense of this, if we're going to teach it, it helps to sort of pick a year and cordon this off and say, okay, this was the classical period and this was the romantic period. And they're two different periods with some things in common, but a lot of things different. But nothing particularly changed in the year 1820 to bring us from the classical era into the romantic era. There was a very gradual shift, and only later do we look back and say, okay, if we're going to pick a year, and scholars sometimes disagree on when these years should be. You can find history books that say the Renaissance began 1400, or sometime even in the 1300s. You might find a music history textbook that says the classical period goes until 1825 instead of 1820. Right. So just be aware that of the artificiality of the useful should be remembered, and take note of them, study them, remember them, whatever. I'm not saying just kind of forget about them, but you should recognize that they are artificial constructs that we use to help ourselves make sense of these eras. Okay, now towards the bottom of this, towards the very end of our unit, it says here, music is probably as old as the human race itself. Flutes made at least 35,000 years ago have been discovered in caves in Germany. Now think about that for a second. You're a caveman living around 35,000 BC, before Christ, or before the Common Era, as it is now usually. They mean the same thing, by the way. The BC means before Christ. BCE means before Common Era, because historians have started to want to sort of like make those designations religiously neutral, although they still refer to the year when traditionally, although probably not in reality, Christ was born. AD, by the way, does not mean after death. That would mean that all the years kind of start from around 33 AD, because that's when we think Christ died. AD means Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, right? Basically measuring from the year of his birth, not from his death. So BC is before Christ, AD is year of our Lord. And by the way, this counting of the years according to Christ, I mean, you can understand it from a Christian point of view, but all civilizations did this, usually with their kings, in the year of the reign of Pharaoh, whichever Pharaoh, Ramses II. Once a new king or a new emperor came to the throne, they would start counting from those years. So Christ being, for Christians, the King of Kings, it made sense at some point to start counting retroactively from the year when he was thought to have been born. So anyway, AD means Anno Domini, year of our Lord. And today, instead of AD, historians, scholars will usually say CE, Common Era. So AD and CE mean the same thing. So we have BC and AD traditionally, and more lately we have BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. And while I'm on this subject, I should also make one other point. If I am talking about the 17th century, I'm talking about the 1600s. Right now, we are living in the 21st century. I was born in the 20th century, but so you see how that works, okay? So just so you don't get confused when I start talking about 18th century this or 19th century that. If I'm talking about the 18th century, I'm talking about the 1700s, okay? Anyway, back to the paragraph I was reading. Music is probably as old as human race itself. Flutes made at least 35,000 years ago. Imagine being a caveman in Germany somewhere, which was, of course, nobody knew it was Germany back then. They were not speaking German. You've got all kinds of things to worry about, like keeping yourself alive, finding food, finding shelter. Well, if you got a cave, I guess you got some shelter. Staying warm. Germany gets cold in the winter. And yet, you're making a flute. And the way they made these flutes, by the way, ingenious. And one of the ways that we know that they're 35,000 years old is because they are made from, very often, the bones of animals that we can either carbon date, or we can figure out, hey, that particular animal went extinct 20,000 years ago. And yet, here we have a leg bone of this animal with holes drilled in it. Cavemen drilling holes. Who knew that they had drills? They had some kind of drill. We know what they did was they would take this bone, they would split it open, they would take the marrow out, they would drill holes at precise locations, and then they'd somehow glue or attach the thing back together again so that they could have a flute. And these flutes are even playable. There have been people braver than me who have taken this 35,000-year-old rotten animal leg bone flute and put it up to their lips, whichever way, and played the thing, right? So that just gives you a sense of how important music is to human beings. Even cavemen liked music, and they went to the trouble of making their own flutes, and who knows what else. There is pictorial evidence of musical activity in Egypt as early as 3000 BC. We know that music played an important role in the cultures of ancient Israel, Greece, and Rome. We know this from their writings, for one thing. They wrote about music often enough. We know that, for example, David, the king of the Israelites, was a harpist, and many of his psalms were written to be accompanied on the harp. They were like songs, not just poems. We know about some of the musical instruments that they played. We know which instruments were used in some religious ceremonies and which were used in other contexts, right? We know that the Greeks had music competitions, just like we do today. In fact, right now, as I'm speaking, the most famous piano competition in the world, the Van Cliburn, is going on in Texas. But they had music competitions back in ancient Greece as well. What I want to do in the time I have remaining, which is not very much, is talk a little bit about the Greeks in particular, and about three people or concepts, people/concepts, that are, I think, important enough to mention, even though the book doesn't get into them. So this is the one occasion where I'm going to talk about some things that are not in the book, that are only found in the lecture, and there are going to be a couple of test questions on these few things. This is the only time I'm going to do this, where I'm going to have something that's in the lecture that I expect you to know that is not also found in the book somewhere. All right. So I think I'm going to start by saying, I'm going to repeat, although I've said this before. The book says, right after that sentence I just read, we know that music played an important role in the cultures of ancient Israel, Greece, and Rome. But hardly any notated music has survived from these ancient civilizations, right? And that's why I'm not going to spend a lot of time on ancient music. There are only about a dozen examples of actual written down music that have been preserved to the present day. The oldest of these, by the way, is far older than the rest of them, and that's the Hurrian cult song, which was discovered, I believe, in modern-day Syria in the 1950s. It's a clay tablet with impressions made on it that we know correspond to music. And in fact, this song has been recorded. It is a hymn to the wife of the moon god. Right? It was important enough to be written down. Most music was not written down, we think, but this was important enough to be written down because it had a religious significance. And it was written down on a clay tablet discovered thousands of years later. The next oldest examples we have are from the first few centuries AD, like from the 200s or so, and we have only a handful of them. Again, we know a great deal about what the Greeks in particular thought about music, what they not just like music theory type stuff, but the role of music in society. Like, for example, should we teach music to children? How much should we teach it? I believe it was Plato who thought that we should strike a balance between music and athletics. That if we did too much of one or the other, if we taught too much athletics, but not enough music, we would wind up with sort of like a society of brutes, of dumb jocks, maybe. And on the other hand, if we taught too much music but not enough athletics, we'd raise like a generation of neurotic sissies. And remember, this is a time when only men were educated, right? Women weren't considered worth educating in ancient Greek culture. And that's kind of interesting in itself, but this isn't one of the three things that I wanted to get into. So there's three specific things that I want to talk about in relation to the Greeks in particular and music. So the first, I really need to talk a little bit about Pythagoras. You have all hopefully heard of Pythagoras. You may be familiar with his theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, which was useful for figuring out the angles and the lengths of the sides of a right triangle. Pythagoras did not discover that. Now, he might have been the first to put it into sort of a formula, but the Egyptians knew about the Pythagorean theorem thousands of years before Pythagoras was born. That's how they were able to build the pyramids, to get those right angles exact. Because if you're building a gigantous pyramid and you don't have exact right angles, you're going to have problems as you get to the top. But Pythagoras First of all, we don't really know that much about Pythagoras himself. He's sort of like almost a quasi-mythical figure. He lived in the 600s or the 6th century, right around there, BC, 600 years before Christ, okay? We don't know a lot really about his life, but he was hugely influential because he inspired sort of like a cult following almost. He was like maybe the easiest way to put it, and this sounds kind of crude and blasphemous, but he was sort of like a prophet. He was like the Jesus of his own religion, his own cult, right? Except that his religion held that the fundamental belief of his religion was that the ultimate reality, the ultimate force of the universe behind everything, right? Behind this material reality that we think is real, but is not really. It's all an illusion or whatever. The ultimate reality, God, in a sense, is math, right? That if you strip away everything, that which remains is math or number, right? And he also believed, or that is to say, he and his followers, because he inspired this movement. There were Pythagorean societies, or sort of like secret societies. They had their own little secret handshake, I guess, that sprung up all over the place because they were sort of considered to be heretics in a sense because they didn't believe in like the gods, the traditional gods of the Greeks or the Romans. No, that's not what it is. It's math. That's the ultimate reality, the ultimate force, not the gods, math. If anything is a god, math is the god. And they also believed that music and math were essentially the same thing, that they were two sides of the same coin, or that music is just math that we can hear, math that is manifest into sounds, right? And one of the reasons that they believe this is because Pythagoras appears to have been the person who discovered the mathematical relationships between the different intervals and the ratios that I've been talking about. For example, the idea that an octave is a 2-to-1 ratio. That was discovered by Pythagoras, and he discovered all the other ratios that correspond to other musical intervals. The story goes that he was inspired to do this because he was walking home one day, walked past a blacksmith shop, and he heard 3 blacksmiths taking turns hammering on a piece of hot metal. If you've got a piece of hot metal, you have to hammer it while it's hot before it cools down. So you might have 3 guys, so that they're each pounding in turn. So Pythagoras walks by and he hears this sort of ping, pong, pong, ping, pong, pong, ping, pong, pong. And he's wondering, what is it that causes the differences in pitch? Does it have something to do with the blacksmith himself, like the stronger blacksmith, if he's hitting it harder, he gets a higher sound, something like this. So he's wondering about this. And based on what we know about sound, think about what the answer might be. So he walks into the blacksmith shop and he says, "Excuse me, fellas, could you do me a favor? I want to run a little experiment here. I want you guys to switch hammers. And I want to see if the sound is caused by you and your particular way of hitting the metal, or if it's something having to do with the hammer." So the guy said, okay. They switch hammers, and the sound stays with the hammer head. It doesn't change because the person has changed, right? And we might have predicted this because the strength of these 3 blacksmiths might be different, but the strength corresponds to the energy that's going into that sound wave, and thus the amplitude. So the stronger guy might have a louder sound, but the pitch isn't going to change because the pitch is dependent on the frequency, which is dependent on the size of the thing being hit. And in this case, it's probably the hammer heads themselves, right? So maybe one hammer is slightly larger, one is slightly smaller. The sound waves on the smaller one are going to be higher pitched. The sound waves on the bigger one are going to be lower pitched. So Pythagoras apparently, if this story is true, discovered this fact, and then went home and started experimenting. He constructed a musical instrument, sort of an experimental instrument, not for playing tunes on, but for experimenting. It was basically sort of like a yardstick very precisely measured, with a peg at one end and a peg at the other end and a string under tension. And he would pluck this string, and then he would stop the string, push it down, and basically just like a guitar, right? Push the string down and pluck just one half of it to see what happened, and he got the octave sound. And then blocked off one third of it, plucked the string, and he got the sound of an octave and a fifth, etc., because the fifth is a 2-to-3 ratio, etc. Pythagoras, the main thing I want you to take away from this is that Pythagoras is the individual who discovered the relationship between the length of a vibrating object, in this case a string, this monochord, which he constructed, although it could be anything, remember, it could be a column of air, it could be a string, it could be a metal bar, whatever. He discovered the relationship between the length of a vibrating medium and the pitch that it'll produce. And he discovered the basis for the ratio, the numeric basis for the common musical intervals, right? And this, again, this sort of like reinforced the idea that that music and math were really just basically the same thing, and that thing is the ultimate reality of the universe, right? Okay, kind of related ideas. There's another idea that the Greeks had, and later, at least educated Greeks who thought about these things, who had the leisure time to sit and think about the wonders of the universe. The Greeks were aware, okay, that most Greeks had this sort of like earth-centered conception of the universe. Although there was one Greek in particular, Aristarchus, who believed that the earth moved around the sun, right? And Copernicus, much later, seems to have read Aristarchus, and that might have been where he got this idea from. But the Greeks believed that Earth was in the center of the universe, right? And the various planets, which they knew that certain of those bright shiny objects were not the same as others because they moved from one night to the other. They called them wanderers, or planets. That's what the word means, a wandering star. And they believed that the sun, the moon, the various planets, and then ultimately this sort of the starry background all moved around the earth. Of course, the starry background only moves over the course of the year, which is really, it's because the earth takes a year to move around the sun, but and they measured precisely the speed at which, well, not the speed, but the rate, how much time it took for these various bodies to move around the earth. They had it all worked out. In fact, they even devised machines that could, very elaborate geared devices where if you like turn the handle, it would make the various planets go around the earth at the correct proportions, right? The speeds being, of course, a ratio of each other and a demonstration of this fundamental order in the universe, which is based on math, which can be discovered via math. It has a mathematical basis. So again, reinforcing this Pythagorean idea that the ultimate reality of the universe can be found in math, right? Anyway, if the planets and the stars and the sun and the moon are moving around the earth in this very mathematically ordered, predictable way, then they must be also making some kind of music as they do so, because music and math are just two sides of the same coin, right? Now, it might be a music that we can't hear down here on earth, but it is very real nonetheless. And in fact, if you have like a Platonist mindset, if you're a devotee of Plato, Plato believed that the material things in our world are not really real. What's real are the eternal forms out there in heaven somewhere, that if you have a dog, well, that's just a physical manifestation of a dog. There is one real sort of eternal form of a dog, right? Might seem a weird idea to us today, but anyway, this idea that as the various heavenly bodies moved around the earth in their precisely mathematical ratios, that is the speed of one to the next in ways that we could discover via math, then they must be making some kind of music. This was called the music of the spheres. the music of the spheres, which we maybe can't hear down here on Earth, but it's very real. In fact, it's more real than the music that we hear on Earth, which is but a pale imitation of the ideal form of music, which is the music of the spheres. One other idea, again, related to this relationship between the ultimate reality and the stuff of the universe and math and music. There was this idea called the doctrine of ethos, E-T-H-O-S, the doctrine or teaching of ethos. And that word ethos, it is basically the root of ethical, right? Ethics, whatever, ethos, related word. And this idea is that the kind of music that you listen to has a direct effect on your soul, on your personality. And you might say, well, I guess that kind of makes sense, like if you listen to depressing music all day, you're going to be depressed. If you listen to, this is an idea that also can be taken in kind of weird directions. Like if you listen to gangster rap all day, does that make you a gangster? If you listen to like death metal, are you going to be suicidal and more likely to, I don't know, do terrible things? There was actually there have been court cases. There was one in particular, very tragic. There was a young guy who had been listening to, I don't know, some kind of heavy metal band and attempted suicide unsuccessfully, in that he survived him and he was terribly mangled, but actually sued, I think it was maybe Judas Priest, or sued some heavy metal band because he argued that the music made him do it. Now, that's not really what the doctrine of ethos was about, though. It wasn't that the words of the music or the sound of thumping rhythm and heavily distorted guitars is going to make you. It was more that since music is made of mathematical ratios, right? And since that's the ultimate reality of the universe, then whatever it is that your soul is made of, atoms or whatever, are going to be affected by the mathematical ratios of music that are going in your ears, and it's going to cause them to either be sort of like disordered or distorted in some way, or harmonious and well-ordered. So what they're talking about is that the kinds of scales that are used in the music you listen to, like whether you're hearing something in Aeolian mode versus Dorian mode versus Phrygian mode, these various scales that the Greeks had, it's going to affect your soul in a certain way. If you listen to too much of that kind of scale versus this other kind of scale, it's going to warp and distort your personality in this particular way, or maybe enhance your personality. Like you listen to this particular scale, you become more virtuous and stronger or whatever. Whereas if you listen to this other kind of scale pattern, you become more neurotic or more flighty or more whatever, right? Again, it seems kind of like an odd idea to us today, perhaps. But in some ways not, because we also have this idea that the kind of music you listen to, at least some of us had this idea, that the kind of music you listen to will affect your personality. It's just the Greeks are talking about it as sort of like at a level almost of physics, right? Rather than of style, right? So those are there's a lot more we could talk about in relation to ancient music, even though we don't have many examples which have been preserved to the present day, which is why we're going to start at the Middle Ages, that is, after the end of the quote-unquote ancient world, because we do have a little bit more written music in the Middle Ages. We do know a little bit more about what that music actually sounded like. So that's where we usually begin a study of music history itself. And that's what we're going to be doing in the following lectures. But for now, as regard to the Greeks, the main things to remember are, number one, the reason why we have so little music preserved to the present day. So little of it was written down, and that which was written down, who knows, it could have been destroyed, lost. There might be still stuff buried that we'll discover in the future. But for now, we have so little of it that's been preserved in written form that we just don't have as much to talk about. And then also recall about Pythagoras, about the music of the spheres, and about the doctrine of ethos. And those are the only things that I might ask about on the test, which aren't also in the book. All right, I think that's about enough. We'll see you next time with an introduction to the historical background material for the Middle Ages. See you then.